Good morning. How's everybody doing this morning? Woo! I'm so excited to be here. Now, let me ask you this. How many love to travel? Anybody love to travel? I love traveling. It's one of my favorite things. My name is Nathan. I'm the lead pastor here at Ridgeline Church, and so glad to be here with you. Everybody have a safe 4th of July. I see most people still have fingers and toes and all of that fireworks. Nobody's eyebrows are missing. So that's really good. I'm super proud. But I love to travel. And recently, as if you've been around the last couple of weeks, you've heard Crystal and I were recently in Israel, and we talked about our trip just a little bit. And so, but recently we're in Israel, and I have to tell you, I have a little confession to make. I cannot stand airport security. Okay, like it drives me nuts. I think the TSA is frustrating at best, and I've got lots of other things I could say that wouldn't be appropriate in church for how I feel about the TSA. But I find it somewhat like humiliating. Like I don't like, you got to take clothes off and shoes off and all that. And you know what dawned on me this time as we were traveling, because now they've got that machine that you got to take your shoes off and you stand in the machine and you got to stand like this now, and then the little thing goes around and it does like this full body scan thing. And this probably scan thing is not the technical term, but so it does that. And then and what dawned on me as I was standing there on the little yellow feet indicators that they have exactly where they want you to put your bare feet is that I am not the first person to stand on those. I'm probably one of hundreds of thousands of people whose bare feet have also stood right here on these little yellow indicators, and I'm quite certain, that nobody has taken a Clorox bleach wipe to those things ever in the history of however long the TSA has been doing those things. All right, and that was an absolutely disgusting and disturbing thought to have while I'm standing there like this with all of my dignity long gone, okay? And so but here's what I've learned. If you're going to fly, and you're going to fly internationally, or you just have to kind of learn to submit yourself or to deal with, or if you want it to go well, probably try to be nice to the people in the TSA. And in other, depending on what nation you're in, their security system and their security people. Now, 3 weeks ago, we started this series, and this is part 4, and we've been looking at the book of Romans. And a couple of weeks, as we've been going through this series, we gave you this cards that has the reading plan on it. And I have to admit, we were supposed to be finished with Romans yesterday, but I'll be finished today or tomorrow, so I'm one day behind. But I've been reading through this. It's been awesome. I hope you've been as well. And if you're behind, that's okay. Just keep reading. Get through Romans. And then we've been given, on the other side of the card, it's had scriptures for you to memorize and to look at and to kind of read over until you're familiar with them and all that. And so we're on week 4 now, and so make sure you're reading that. Actually, week 4 starts tomorrow, so I'm ahead. I'm an overachiever. I knew it. I have to call my mom after service. So make sure you read over the verses and you read through the plan for this week, because, man, the book of Romans is so great, and there's a lot of great theology. There's a lot of, what do we believe as Christians about this, or how to deal with this or that? Romans, man, is a great way to help you understand that. And in week 1, we looked at Romans chapter 1, and we asked the question, does my day-to-day life mirror the beliefs that I say that I hold? And then in week 2, we looked at this. Have I made Jesus into my likeness? We looked at Romans chapter 8. Have I made Jesus into my likeness, or am I striving to be like Jesus? And then in week 3, last week, Crystal did an amazing job teaching us through the first part of Romans 12. And she made this statement. It says, if we realized how powerful our negative thoughts were, we'd never think a negative thought again. And she talked about the power of renewing your mind. And so today we're going to talk about authority. And the reality is that we're all under authority in just about every area of our life. And it's hard now, let me say that it's hard to talk about authority as a pastor, because some of you, you're thinking, oh, the pastor's just talking about authority because he wants to be the authority in my life. And so moving along, everyone is, no, I'm just kidding. No, but it's true. Like, it's hard as a pastor to talk about authority because, he just wants to be able to. And you know what? I do want you to live the way that God has instructed and intended for you to live. And sometimes that means talking about subjects that are super uncomfortable for me. And so everyone is under authority, the authority of someone in your life. There's no place that we can go in our lives where we're not under authority. And not just in the big things like you go to work and you have a boss, but in day-to-day life, there is not a place in the world that we can go where we're not under authority. I mean, we go out in nature and we're under kind of the laws of nature. Well, if you go to a restaurant, then the manager has the authority to kick you out of that restaurant if you misbehave. If we hang out at your house, your wife's there. If we hang out at my house, my wife's there. So we're always all under authority, okay? And so, but it's most of the time we're okay with it and we're used to it, and it's not a big deal, but sometimes we're not, and sometimes we get frustrated or fed up with authority, and sometimes we have this desire to kind of despise our aging parents who give us dated advice. Or sometimes we have this desire to rebel against our ignorant boss. Or sometimes we have this desire to kind of ignore a government that maybe we didn't vote for. Or sometimes we have this desire to flip a table at a restaurant and punch the face of a server who brings you tomatoes when you said no tomatoes. Maybe that last one's just me, okay? But when I was younger, especially, not so much anymore, I've really mellowed out at restaurants. But I don't know what it is about a restaurant that just made me so angry. Like, I always felt like I just wanted to fight the server who messed up my order in the smallest way. And I would fight, too. I would want to fight, especially if that server was shorter, lighter, younger, female, and preferably white. I would fight. Oh my goodness, yeah, for real? No, that's a joke. Okay, so, but maybe you've been told to do something that wasn't right or wasn't fair by someone in authority over you. And I'm not going to listen, and you said, you know what, I'm not going to listen to someone who's wrong. I mean, why would I have to listen to someone who's wrong? Or you've got hassled by maybe, a rent-a-cop, or you're at the movies or something, or maybe you didn't do anything wrong at all, and you're just hanging out at an ice cream place, and a sheriff's deputy comes in, and he confronts you and then almost tases you in front of your kids. Again, maybe that one's just on me, but of course, everyone around me is saying, when I'm in these situations, Nathan, how come you can't just be nice to the server? Or Nathan, how come you can't be nice to the sheriff's officer? Or whatever. And even though the manager, this is how I feel sometimes, and again, not as much anymore, but I used to feel it, like even though this manager that's serving me at a restaurant is half my age and obsessed with tomatoes, and I've told him 100 times that I don't like tomatoes, right? What is it? Why does he keep getting it wrong? And what is it in me that has a problem with him? Like, why is that my go-to? Why is it that I assume that somehow I'm smarter, or why is it that I assume that I could do his job better when I have no experience hardly waiting tables? Why is that in me? Why is that my natural go-to? And why do we assume that we know more than our parents who maybe are getting a little up in their age? Or why is it that we assume that we know more than our dumb boss? Or why is it we know more than our slow-moving government? If I was in charge, if I was president, why do we assume that we know more? And why is that our natural instinct to immediately get on the defensive when it comes to people in authority in our life? Why do we assume that the reason we feel this way is because of some deficiency or some fault in them? Why is that our natural go-to? What's wrong with them? And why, when we start to feel the slightest hint of authority becoming a burden in our life, or a problem, or getting in the way of what we're trying to do, why do we become threatened? And why does it stir up so much anger and bitterness in our lives? And to understand really why we feel this way, we have to go all the way back to the beginning, to Adam and Eve. And see, in the Bible, in Genesis, it says that God created the world in 7 days, or in 6 days, and then on the seventh day he rested, and God created Adam and Eve on day 6, or Adam on day 6, and then later creates Eve. And God's plan for Adam and Eve the whole time was to provide, protect, love, cherish, care for, to shape and to form and lovingly lead them. That was God's plan for their life. He wanted to provide, protect, love, care, shape, and form their lives. And so, as if you know the story, if you've ever been in Sunday school or read the book of Genesis, or you've heard, the devil in the form of a snake, he comes and tempts Adam and Eve, and he gets them to question God's character and look down on God's abilities. And the snake convinces them that they are a victim of God's authority rather than a beneficiary of it. And so then they bite the fruit and they buy into the lie that they are better off out from under God's authority. And Adam and Eve, that God is a bad boss. That's kind of the lie that they buy into, that they're better off out from under God's authority, and that God is he's not a good leader, he's not a good boss, he's not, his way of doing things isn't a good way. And so because of what Adam and Eve did, now the Bible tells us that we are all born into sin and that we are all shaped into iniquity, and we're born into this, and the same attitude that Adam and Eve had about God's authority is now embedded or ingrained into each one of us. And now we all love to say things like, and maybe you haven't said this in years, but we all love to say things like, "You can't tell me what to do." We love to say that. Of course, the older we get, the less we say it like that. We say it more politically correct. Maybe you tell your boss, "Well, that's not my department." But what you're, in essence, you're saying the exact same. "You can't tell me what to do." Or maybe, we say things like, "Get that file off my desk before I bash your face into it." Okay, maybe that one's just me again, but so we all say these different types of things when it comes to authority. And so the Apostle Paul talks about this thing that is inside of all of us in the book of, Ephesians. I'm just kidding. In the book of Romans, and Paul, a guy who dealt with some authority issues. And so here's what he says in Romans chapter 13. All right, verse 1, it says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established." The authorities that exist have been established by God. Verse 2, "Consequently, whoever rebels against the authorities is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves." And so Paul is saying that all authority is God's authority. And if you push back against someone in authority in your life, then you better have a darn good reason, like that person is leading a Holocaust or something. You better have a really good reason, because if they're not, then you are actually pushing back against the authority of God in your life. And what we have to understand is that God created authority. God is the author of authority, and he wants to make sure that you are well taken care of. And so he set up roles and structure like government and commerce and trade and education and marriage and parents and kids and bosses and employees. All of these things were God's idea, and he set them up, and everything we need to have in order to have kind of order here on earth, God has given us through the umbrella of authority. And we've all been placed in the positions that we're currently in. Whether or not, whatever your position is at your job, whether or not you're the boss and you have people under you, or you're an employee and you have people over you, or and wherever you're at on your company org chart, or however that works, you have been placed there in that position by God. And the authority that you have was set up by God, and the authority your ignorant boss has was set up by God, and the authority that your mean parents have, that was God's doing, and your tough teacher, that was set up by God, or this slow-moving government or whatever, that was all set up by God. And he established it. So why? So we can be protected, so we can be provided for, so we can be loved, cared for, and that way he can shape us and form areas of our lives. But we naturally push back against authority, don't we? Because of Adam and Eve. Not because of that person's faults or deficiencies. But we push back because being led or being ruled over, it irritates this thing that's inside of us that reminds us of God's authority in our lives that we naturally want to rebel against. because of our own sin nature and because of what Adam and Eve did. And this is why why we struggle with God's authority in all of its earthly forms. This is exactly the reason. It's all connected. The reason you have authority issues is ultimately because of your authority issues with God. And see, if you are here and you're not a Christ follower, you may be saying, you know what, that can't exactly be true. And you know what, you don't have to believe what we believe to come to our church. But let me show it to you this way. Let me say it to you this way. Here's what I've learned when studying is that what are the three most common complaints people have about authority? Here, I'll show you the top three most common complaints people have about authority. Here's what they are. Number one is that authority is inept. Authority is inept. Well, they're not as smart as I am, right? They don't know what I know. Man, if they saw the company the way I saw the company, they certainly wouldn't be running it this way, right? Authority, your boss is inept, your parents are inept, nobody's as smart as you, everybody, right? What's the second thing? Unjust. Right? The system doesn't work. Right? Our system, I can't believe, our justice system doesn't work, and our government, the three branches of government that are supposed to keep themselves all in checks and balance, all of that, it doesn't work. Unjust. Number three, absent. I go to work every day, and I do everything. My boss, he's taking all these nice vacations, or he's always out on his boat, or I stay home and work so hard, and my husband comes home, makes a mess, or I stay home and my wife comes home and she never cleans up after the kids, I just finally cleaned the car and then she borrowed it, there's all these they're absent. I do everything and they don't do anything. And when we have these thoughts about authority, that they're inept, they're unjust, and they're absent, what does it do? It makes you and me the victims, and it gives us an excuse. I shouldn't have to listen to a boss. I shouldn't have to listen to a boss who's inept. This guy doesn't know what he's doing. Why would I listen to him? I don't have to listen to a boss. Can you believe how unjust president is? Why would I have to submit myself to a president who's come on. My parents, they're never around. They're always at work. They don't care about me. Why would I have to listen to my parents? They're always absent. And it gives you and I an excuse. But here, let me show you this. Here's the interesting part. What are the three most common complaints about God? You know what they are? Number one, why do bad things happen in this world? In other words, why is God inept? This is the number one complaint that if you ask people about God, why do bad things happen in this world? God, come on, God, you don't seem to be doing a very good job up there, right? You're pretty inept at what you're doing. Number two, why does all this stuff happen to me? What does that mean? God, if don't you see I'm a good person, I'm really trying here? It just doesn't seem fair. Number three, why do I feel alone and like God doesn't exist? What is he saying? Absent. The three most common complaints about God are the exact same complaints that we have about all the other authorities in our lives, making you and me the victims and giving us an excuse to step out from under the authority that God has placed in our lives. And it's the same complaints. Why? Because it all goes back to this thing that is inside of us that comes from Adam and Eve that says we're better off without your provision and your protection and your love and your care and your authority in my life, and I'm going to do my own thing. Meaning at the end of the day that all of our authority issues really are God issues. And there's this guy in the Bible, his name's Peter, and he's one of the 12 disciples, one of the 12 apostles. And in a letter to a church in Asia Minor, which would be modern-day Turkey now, he expands on this thought from Paul that we just read in Romans. And this is what Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2, and starting in verse 13, he says, Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to the governors who are servants sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to command those who do right. And this is what he said. Oh, and then jump down to verse 17. He says this, show proper respect to everyone, love your fellow believers, fear God, honor the emperor, slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. So Peter is talking about authority. Now, understanding context here, when we talk about slaves, we're not talking about slaves in the context of American history. We're talking about slaves as people who have sold themselves off into slavery to pay off a debt or something along those lines. And we talked about that in more detail in week 1. And so make sure you get caught up. If you've missed a couple weeks or missed a week here and there, make sure you get caught up on the series on our new website, ridgelineasheville.info. You can click there and find all the videos. So, so this is Peter. And so Peter is writing to a group of Christians, to a church, to a group of maybe a lot like us here today. And these people already know that they already know that all of their authority issues have been forgiven through Jesus, right? Every time we've ever rebelled, all of our rebellion, all of that has been forgiven for what Jesus did on the cross. But in other words, people who've said, Peter is writing to people who've said, you know what, I submit my life to God's authority. Right? I give my life to Jesus. I want to be a Christ follower. I submit my life to God's provision, to God's protection, to God's love and care, his authority, so that because of this, Peter is telling them that they now, because they consider themselves to be Christ followers, they now have to submit to earthly authorities. And he's telling them that you can't say that I'm under God's authority, or I'm a Christian, or I'm a Christ follower, but you can't say that I hate my boss. You can't say that I'm going to speed. Or you can't say, that one hurts every time I have to say that one. All right, you can't say, I'm not going to listen to my parents. You can't say that. Why? Because God is using those authorities in your life to provide and protect and to love and care for and shape you and form you. And when we push back against them, we are pushing back against his provision and his protection and his love and his care and the way that he is shaping and forming our lives through those persons. And yes, sometimes the people that he places in authority over us are more broken than we are, or not as smart, or sometimes they're absent, and sometimes they're unjust. All those things can be true. But to be a Christ follower whose life is submitted to God's authority, it means that we have to submit to our earthly authorities. And so here's a couple things for you for you to see is what does that mean? How do I submit? What does that mean? What does that look like? And I understand maybe for some of us here today, submit is a really strong word. It just has this bad, like you say all the way that your dad treated your mom, and you equate that with submission, and you're going like, I'm never gonna marry a guy like that, right? Like you. But let's talk about what does it look like. Number 1, respect. Respect. Respect the position or the title. Okay? You may not have to respect the person sometimes, like in and of themselves, but just because they're the president, I choose not to talk bad about them, and I choose to pray for them. I may not individually, like on a personal level, may ever want to meet them or agree with their politics or agree with the way that their stance on certain social, moral, economic issues, whatever, it doesn't matter. But because they are the president of the United States of America, then I respect them and I respect the office that they hold. And not just when they deserve it or when they're around. Okay? Respect is a constant. It's not just when your boss walks into the room, you stop all the bad things you were just saying about him and then show him some respect, right? That's not how respect works. So what does respect look like? It looks like eye contact. It looks like your boss's name, maybe with their proper title. Doctor, or Mr. or Mrs. If they're older than you, significantly older than you, like Crystal is to me, then, like Mrs. Chowdhury. But if, but eye contact, title with the name. Crystal's like 9 months older than I am. Be polite, okay? Why? Because they deserve it? No, because God put them there. Number Number 2, grace. How do you submit? You show grace. Understand that they are just as broken as you are, that we're all humans. We've all failed. We've all sinned. We've all are a victim of the things that have gone on in life. Like we all have to deal with it a lot of times the same way. And so what does grace look like? That you're not better than your boss. You're not better than your parents. You're not better. And grace looks like forgiveness. Extending forgiveness. It looks like giving the benefit of the doubt. It looks like believing the best. Choosing to believe the best. And don't be so naive to think that the complaints that you have about your boss, somebody doesn't have about you. Don't be so naive to think that complaints that you have about your parents, your parents didn't have about their parents, and your kids won't have about you. Don't be so naive to think that. Number 3. Oh, back one. There we go. Obey. Again, this is a tough one. I understand this is a kind of a big one. And again, you're over spanked or abused as a kid, and it was all for the sake of obedience or discipline or whatever. And so this can be a strong term, and I understand. But obedient, not just in actions, okay, but in your attitude. Okay? And some of you are saying, well, blindly? Well, as long as it doesn't break the law or go against your Christian beliefs or the Bible, yeah. And obey is number 3 on purpose, because we kind of worked up in difficulty here. And it's the hardest one. And it's meaningless to just do number 3 without doing 1 and 2. If you only obey but you don't have respect or grace for, then your obedience is completely misused. It will have no weight. It will seem almost suspicious. And it's the hardest one, and it's meaningless to only do number 3. And if we obey in our actions and not in our attitudes, then it makes us hypocritical. And nobody likes hypocritical Christian. Here's an interesting thought that I want you to see. A person who is in submission to their authorities looks for the strengths of their leader. Well, a person in rebellion looks for the weaknesses. Isn't that interesting? Your perspective about your boss is tainted by your motivations. Your perspective of your parents is tainted by your motivations. Your perspective of, whomever in your life that's in authority over you is tainted by your motivations. What are you looking for? A person who is in submission to their authorities or to their boss or to their parents looks for strengths of their leader, while a person in rebellion looks for the weaknesses. And you know what's interesting? Both can always be found. If you decide tomorrow to show up at work and look for all of your boss's weaknesses, you will find them. But in the same way, if you decide to show up to work tomorrow and look for all of your boss's strengths, you will find them. It's all about the way that you show up to work. And our perspective, the way that changes, has nothing to do with any changes that happens in our authority figure or in our boss, but has everything to do with what we end up looking for in the people in authority over us. And so both can always be found. The strengths are there. You just may have never noticed them before, because you've got that thing inside of you, just like I do, just like Adam and Eve did. But if you look for them, you'll find them. And I know what a lot of you maybe are thinking, but I understand this, kind of at a level of, this is Bible and this is good and this is what I should do with my life. And I understand it on that level, but Nathan, you don't know how bad my boss really is. He's a real jerk, like a real jerk. And jerk is putting it nicely. Or you don't understand how abrasive my spouse really can be. Or you don't get how horrible my parents are, or my homeowners association is, or you don't understand how mean the crossing guard is, and she's always yelling at you to slow down while you're driving through a school zone, even though you're going under the designated speed limit, and all you want to do someday is just pull over and tell her what to do with that sign. Okay, maybe that one only happens to me, but most of the time, what most of us would call misuse of authority is really the reality of being under someone who's just as broken as we are, and making the same mistakes that we would make if we were in their position. And you know what? You may have a point about your boss being a jerk, or your husband being abrasive, your wife being abrasive, or your parents don't let you have any fun. But we serve a God who is big enough to work around those things or overcome those wrongdoings. And if he doesn't, then know that he is using that in your life to help shape you and to help form you. Now, to those of you who've truly been abused by people in your life that are supposed to be, that have kind of maybe misused that God-given authority, I just want to say that as someone who is a dad and is a husband, is a pastor, whatever, man, I am so sorry that happened to you. And I'm not in any way using this message to justify abuse, or when somebody steps out of line, or when things get taken too far, or I'm not in any way saying that those things are okay, because those things are not okay. And I want you to know that I'm so sorry that those things have happened to you if you've been in that place where somebody has misused their God-given authority. And I just want you to know that God's heart breaks for you when you're in those situations, when you were in that situation. And understand that was never God's intention. It was never God's intention for the people above you and in your authority in your life to misuse that and to abuse that. That was never the heart of God. His intention was only for good things to come from the authority that he placed in your life. And understand that at the end of their life, God will hold them accountable for how they misused their authority. And you see, when it comes to this, Peter, the apostle that we read from earlier, understood this probably more than we ever could imagine we could relate to. Did you know who Peter was writing about when he said in verse 13, submit to the emperor? Do you know who the emperor was at that point? Just after Jesus had died and been resurrected, and this is just a few years after that. The emperor was Nero, who would dip Christians in wax, and in hot wax, boiling hot wax, and impale them with poles and light them on fire around the palace just for a good time. This is the guy, when Peter said submit to the emperor, he was talking about Nero, a guy that killed Christians just for the fun of it. Maybe just because he was having a bad day. And he wanted to bring some fun to his evening. Because when I think of fun, naturally, I think of impaling Christians, right? Like, what is wrong with this guy? But Peter explains why all of this is so important. And he does so right in the middle of the verses that we read from Peter. And this is what he says in verse 15, which we skipped over earlier. He says, for it is God's will that by doing good, you should silence the ignorant talks of the foolish. This is why. This is why we should submit ourselves to authority. This is the purpose. This is what God's trying to, not just because he wants to protect you and love you, but also because it will change the way that people around you. When you decide to submit to the authority in your life, you will stand out. When you decide that you're no longer going to talk bad about your boss at work, you're going to begin to stand out. When you decide among your peer group that you're not going to talk bad about your parents anymore in school, you're going to stand out. I'm not going to talk bad about that. Why? Because if I'm really honest about it, it could only be the working of God that got this genius to be my boss anyway, right? Like if we're really being honest, sometimes that might be, it's only God's hand that could have put this guy as the boss, right? And so, but you'll begin to stand out when you decide that you're not going to talk bad about your authorities. You'll stand out to whom? The people at work that say, you know what, God's not real. or that all Christians are hypocrites, or that the ignorant talk of the foolish, Peter says. You'll stand out among those who are ignorant about what you believe. You'll stand out as well to those who are in authority over your life. You'll get noticed when you stop talking bad about your boss, or you stop undermining every decision that he makes, or you'll begin to be noticed by those in authority over you. And you know what? That may be the key to a promotion or a pay raise. Why? Why is God telling you all this? What's the point of authority? To protect and provide, like all of these things. And so by doing some of these basic things, by not talking bad about your boss, there might be a promotion in that for you. And God's using that, to provide. Why? Because people who get this authority thing stand out. So my hope for you is not that your boss gets fired, or that you never get pulled over again. That's my hope for me. But that your parents make your curfew 2 hours later, or that your teacher gives you an A. As wonderful as all those things may be, that's not my hope for you. But rather, my hope for you is that the next time you feel that thing rise up on the inside of you that says, you know what, I don't want to listen to this. You can't tell me what to do. That you remember where it comes from, and you push back against that thing instead of pushing back against the authority that God has placed in your life. And the next time you get pulled over, that you remember that the cop is just trying to do his job and keep the streets safe. Or the next time you get bad service at a restaurant, that you get a bad server at a restaurant, you just remember that that server is just trying to feed their family and stay out of trouble with their manager. And the next time you think your boss is inept, you remember that he's just under a lot of pressure that probably you don't even know anything about, and he's just trying to run the place as best as he knows how, and that he's just as broken as you are. Because at the end of the day, all authority is God's authority. And so here it is. You ready? May you be blessed with the provision and the protection and the love and the care that comes from submitting to the authority that God has placed in your life. Why? Because ultimately, a person who is in submission to their authority looks for the strengths of their leader, while a person in rebellion looks for the weaknesses. And both will always be found. Let's pray. Father, I thank you that authority was your idea, and you placed authority in our lives to help provide, protect, love, care for, form, and shape each one of our lives into who you've called us and want us to be. And Father, I pray that even probably this week, as we go home and we go back to work and we deal with parents and we deal with coworkers and bosses and we deal with the restaurants and deal with all the different police officers and all the different things that happen in our lives, and when that thing rises up inside of us that wants to challenge authority, God, I pray you'd remind us of this message, and that we would push back against that thing instead of pushing back against authority, that we would push back against that thing instead of removing ourselves out from under your protection and your provision and your love and your care for us in the way that you've set it up through authority. Father, I pray ultimately at the end of the day that we would learn how to better submit ourselves to your authority in our lives. Because you are a good, good Father that loves us and cares for us, wants to provide and protect us. In Jesus' name, amen.